Located in the middle of the rural Delmarva Peninsula is the farming community of Laurel, Delaware.
Laurel is probably the epitome of a small town community, the traditional values, and at the time, a very safe community. Everybody knew everybody, and they felt very safe in their homes.
30-year-old single mom Kay Robinson has spent her entire life in this area and now lives in a modest home of her own with her 12-year-old son, Nick.
Sorry, Annie.
My son's father wasn't really in the picture. We had been on our own since he was 4. And I was a determined mother that because I was a single mother, that he wasn't going to have any less than any of the full-time parents had for their children. So I worked hard. We spent a lot of time together, and we were best friends.
It's taken Kay time to move on from Nick's dad, but now she has a new love, her 36-year-old fiancé, Andrew Simmons.
I was very happy with Andrew. We were soulmates. We were engaged, and we had a commitment to each other, but we just hadn't set a date because I was still afraid to make that leap again.
Oh, shoot. Sorry, honey.
Oh, hey, you.
Hey.
Hey, Nick.
Hey. With any pieced together family where the child is from a different parent, there's a little bit of friction there.
Hey, why don't you toss it over here, buddy? It's a good throw.
Well, finally, someone who knows how to throw a baseball.
Well, I know when I'm not wanted. Sure you don't mind?
Nah, not at all.
Okay. I have a couple meetings this afternoon, so I'm gonna go freshen up.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll see you soon. All right, let's see you, buddy. Oh, man. That had some mustard on it, huh?
What can I say?
He cared for him. He did for him. We were well blended. I felt that I was in a very good place. I wasn't rich. I didn't have a lot of money, but I had what I needed. I was very happy with my life.
As her son's sole financial provider, Kay works hard as an insurance saleswoman to make ends meet.
So I really think you'll be better off with a higher deductible. You're such a safe driver, and it'll cut your premiums by 30%.
Listen, I don't know. What if something happens? Am I gonna have to pay $1,000 to get a tow truck to come out here?
No, see, that's the best part. Here, let me show you.
I was a hard worker. I like to educate people as to their needs so that they don't suffer catastrophic losses. So if they have a life event, that it's not something that's going to destroy their family.
Okay, great. So just sign and date here.
Okay. So you really think I can save some money?
I really do.
Kay's a very slight lady, very quiet, kept to herself. She was being stalked at that time, and she had no idea it was happening.
But it's not long before Kay does start to get the feeling that something's not right.
You scared me half to death.
I'm so sorry. I was just heading out to meet the guys. Figured I'd get a little pick-me-up.
Andrew, he was an avid deer hunter, and he would go to Virginia and hunt Sika deer. So if he was coming through at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, he would just stop in. He had a key to my house. There was an implied permission You're welcome anytime. The door's always open.
Oh, my gosh. You didn't actually call the cops, did you?
No.
Okay. All right, well, promise me something. Okay, next time you hear someone in your house at this hour, please do.
I promise.
Over the next few weeks, Kay comes to expect these late-night visits from Andrew. Still, there are many nights when she and Nick are all alone.
Nick! Nick?
It was a work night. I was going to bed, but my son was scared.
Nick? What's the matter, honey?
Just someone outside.
He said, Mommy, somebody's trying to get in my window.
No, baby, you're fine.
I told him that everything was locked. There was no way anybody was getting in that window, but he was still scared.
Why don't you come sleep in my room, okay?
Kay settles into bed with Nick for the night, convinced the two are safe. That is until early in the wee hours of the morning.
There was a loud knock on the door, and it was so loud, it was startling, and it angered me because I just couldn't imagine who is going to come to your house at almost 1 o'clock in the morning. And I thought, forget it, I'm not answering it. But they were persistent.
Okay.
I could see a man was standing there. He had on a flannel shirt, long sleeve shirt, which I thought was odd because it wasn't really cold out.
Can I help you?
Yeah, my car broke down. I was hoping I could use your phone to call a friend and get a ride. Can I come in?
I said, no, you can't come in, but if you'd like me to make a phone call for you, I will do that.
All right. His number is 302.
Hang on, let me grab a pen.
I'm half asleep, but I'm obviously not going to let a stranger in my house in the middle of the night.
Okay, go ahead.
So he gave me the telephone number.
Yeah, ask for Ben. Tell him I'm broken down on 13 near East Point Road.
Okay, and what's your name?
My name? Jack Wilson.
Okay, hang on.
So I dialed the number.
Hello?
Hi, I'm really sorry to disturb you. Jack Wilson asked me to call. His truck is broken down on Highway 13.
Who?
Jack Wilson? He said to ask for Ben. Is this Ben?
It didn't seem like I really woke them, but they were irritated, and he said, I don't know Jack Wilson, and there's nobody by the name of Ben here.
Are you sure?
Lady, there's no Ben at this number.
I was convinced at that point that the people didn't know him and that the story didn't make sense. My first thought was, who's knocking on my door?
30-year-old Kay Robinson is pondering what to do with a late-night stranger at her door.
I went back to the door and I said, I'm sorry, they said they don't know who you are. He was getting agitated, and he said, no, you dialed the wrong number.
Listen, why don't you let me come in and I'll call him myself?
No. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna let you in. Now, please leave, or I'll have to call the police.
Well, thanks for nothing.
He said a few words of profanity, kicked the ground, and he walked away.
Fearful the late-night visitor could return, Kay's next call is to the Delaware State Police.
After I hung up the phone, I felt at ease that they would check it out. They would most likely locate him. Maybe he had been drinking, get a DUI, they would take him in. I felt comfortable, I went back to bed.
Convinced her troubles are over, Kay is soon sleeping again soundly, until an hour and a half later,
I heard my front door slam, and my first thought was, it was Andrew coming in, and I was thinking, why is he slamming the door? He's gonna wake my son up. So I got up out of bed, a little bit agitated.
but the moment she steps into the living room, Kay is hit by an unexpected sight.
That's when I saw in the mirror that the same man was crouched in my kitchen beside my trash can with a butcher knife. As soon as I saw his reflection in the mirror, I knew it was the same man. And I saw the knife, and I screamed and turned to run.
Who else is here?
Just my son.
I said, my son is here, but he's sleeping. He said, are you sure he's sleeping? And I said, yes.
Where is he?
Luckily, the intruder doesn't seem interested in her son. He is more concerned with finding a place that he and Kay can be alone.
He tried to get me to go into my son's bedroom. And at that point, I'm thinking I'm going to be raped. And I said, there's no way. He's going to kill me first.
Let's go. Let's go. Let's go.
He was getting agitated, and he started stabbing at me with a knife. I'm thinking to myself, break it. But when he stabbed at me again, I just grabbed the top of the knife and I just snapped it. And I was very naive, so instead of using the knife against him, I threw it. And when he went for the knife, I went for the phone.
Nick, run!
Shut up.
He quickly came out and grabbed me away from the phone. My primary concern was my son's safety. I really didn't know if he was asleep. I was praying that he was. I thought that he was.
But Nick isn't asleep. Not anymore.
It just woke me up, and I thought it was fake. And then within seconds, I realized, no, she wouldn't prank me. You know, that's not a prank.
You better not have woke him up or I'll kill you both.
I was thinking I need to go out the window, but I was scared to do it. I need to get up and go, but how do you know when to go?
As Kay and her attacker enter the back bedroom, the torture only continues.
Put your hands behind your back. Do it or I'll kill him.
He told me, this is it. If you don't let me tie you up, I'm going to kill your son. He tied it so tight and so fast that I knew it wasn't the first time he had done it. My hands started going numb, and I'm thinking, it's so tight, I'll never be able to get out.
Stay here. Don't move.
Kay, during this entire struggle, went along with whatever his demands were, willing to do whatever he wanted if it would just keep him away from Nikki.
The threat to Nick once again subsides as the man returns, but not without a terrible surprise.
Come on. Let's go. On the bed.
this man simply wanted to control, dominate. He had gotten her into a completely helpless mode and then sexually assaulted her. He was just pure evil.
But even after the assault, Kay's attacker doesn't let up.
Such a pretty neck.
He climbed on my back, and he had sat in the arch of my back and grabbed the front part of my hair and pulled my neck back as far as he could get it. And he proceeded to start cutting my throat. He cut the right side and then the left side, trying to decapitate me.
But even as the vile man stabs Kay over and over again, she doesn't make a sound.
At that point, I believed that he's not going to stop until I'm dead. So I stopped breathing. I held my breath. And as hard as it was, I mean, he was stabbing me over and over and cutting my throat and trying to cut my ear off. And I didn't make any noise.
You still with me, bitch?
All I could think is this it? Is this how I'm gonna die? And they say your life flashes before your eyes. And I guess I had a different concept of what that would be, but it's not like you see everything that's happened. It's more like everything that's gonna happen, things you didn't get to do.
Convinced Kay is dead, her attacker disappears out of the room, and Kay's fear for her life is soon replaced by panic.
And I was so scared. I was afraid he's going to my son. I was fading in and out of consciousness because I had lost so much blood. But my sole purpose was to keep my son safe.
Brutally attacked and left for dead, Kay Robinson fears her 12-year-old son, Nick, might be next.
I was wide awake, but I pretended to be asleep. Everybody knows, you know, if something goes down and it's major, you know, nobody wants witnesses. My heart was pounding, and it was hard to control my breathing, you know what I mean? And I was like literally like shaking, like if you were freezing cold, shivering. It was weird. It was like, because when the door was closed, I couldn't control it, but when he came and checked, I could control it. It was crazy. I would just be sitting there listening and waiting for him, you know, to leave, or when I felt like it was okay to go out there. Finally, I just said, screw it. If I'm gonna go, I gotta go, you know what I mean? So I got up and opened up the door, you know, and walked out there.
Mom?
I didn't have no clue, like, it was that severe, you know. I thought really it was more like him trying to rob us or something, you know. I didn't think he was trying to kill her.
Mom?
I knew my neck was bad, so I rolled over on my stomach because I didn't want my son to see it.
But what Kay doesn't realize is that her back is even worse.
Oh, God. Mom, no.
Every time she would breathe, blood would just pump out of her back, like every hole, every spot he had stabbed her in. There was so much blood. He had drew like a smiley face on her back in blood. There's no words to describe it, really. I mean, you see horror movies, it was like that. It was just like a horror movie.
Please, please go get help.
Please! Somebody help, please! Please, no! Open the door! Please, no! It's my mom! You have to come save her, please! Please!
Nick makes it safely to a neighbor's house, who calls 911 right away.
911, what's your emergency? It's my next door neighbor has been robbed and she's been stabbed. It sounded like they might have raped her.
Right away, Kay is rushed into emergency surgery. As she clings to life in the ICU, she remains unable to speak for several days. But the moment she is stable, she meets with Delaware State Police, well aware that her attacker is still on the loose.
Kay? Detective Doug Hudson.
Hi, Detective.
She was in horrible shape. She had been stabbed at least 25 times in the back, and then her throat cut in 3 or 4 different places. From her injuries, her odds of survival were very slim. But Kay had the will to live.
What can you tell me about this guy?
A lot.
I had stored everything that I could possibly store. What he looked like, what he smelled like, the length of his fingernails. Apparently, victims are normally scared to turn in their attacker. I wasn't scared. If he's out there, he's gonna do it to somebody else. I wanted to make sure this guy was caught.
I'm gonna have a police artist come down and talk to you, all right? So we can put out a sketch. Don't worry. We're gonna get this guy.
But even though state police are able to recover DNA evidence from the sexual assault on Kay, it's no good without a suspect to compare it to. So Detective Hudson immediately starts searching for the man who calls himself Jack Wilson.
We did traces on the phone number that he had given her. We interviewed the people that Kay called, and that went nowhere. We determined that there was no Jack Wilson.
A few days into the investigation, the sketch generated from Kay's memory of her assailant brings new energy to the case.
This just came for you, sir. So this is our guy. That's him. All right, let's get it out to the media right away. Get some flyers made up too. Good work.
It went out to the press, and it was in all the papers and on the local TV stations because we want information. We asked for information from anyone that knew this person or recognized them to call us, and we would investigate from there.
Nine days after the attack, Kay is released from the hospital, but her return home brings a wave of emotions.
Andrew, I can't go back in there.
I knew that I would no longer make my home there, so I made plans to get it cleaned up and get it sold.
I'm just gonna grab a couple things for you, okay? It'll be fine.
Can you just take me back to your place, please?
There was still some recovery where I needed help, so I went to stay with my boyfriend for a while.
Meanwhile, the state police tip line receives numerous calls regarding the composite sketch, but none of the leads pan out. That is until 2 weeks after the attack.
911, what's your emergency?
I want to report a suspicious person.
A neighbor of Kay's saw a man outside of her house. He apparently was lighting a candle acting strange. And obviously, this was something that the neighbor felt police needed to know.
Sir, do you live around here?
His name was Doug DeSilva. He was from Lanham, Maryland, and he said he was there praying for Kay. He had heard about the incident.
Do you know Miss Robinson? But I felt bad for what happened, so. What is that?
On Doug DeSilva's windshield, he had taped a picture of the composite so that he could ride around the area and look for the suspect. Nothing made any sense. He had no reason to be there. His demeanor and his mental state were just didn't make any sense.
And there's something even more troubling to the officer.
Doug DeSilva looked like the composite sketch. Well, he became a very strong person of interest at that point.
After a suspicious man is found outside the home of sexual assault victim Kay Robinson, Delaware State Police have brought him in for questioning.
So you say you can't remember if you were in Laurel on September 18th? I might have been. I lose track of the days, so...
Doug DeSilva had the opportunity to explain his presence, explain his whereabouts, and no longer be in the picture. But yet he somehow almost taunted police.
But despite his resemblance to the police sketch of Kay's attacker, state police lack the evidence necessary to make an arrest. So they have no choice but to let DeSilva go.
So if we got any more questions, we will give you a call. Well, I got a question for you. How do I get a job like yours?
He actually told them that he would like to be a state policeman and would like to get an application. So the state police humored him, and they gave him an application.
You hear?
With their only suspect now back on the streets, detectives are eager to see if Kay can point them to anyone else. But to their surprise, they end up right back where they started.
Oh my God. That's him.
We did a photo lineup with Kay and Nick separately and independent of each other. Kay picked out Doug DeSilva and was very sure of it.
When I saw him, it was like a sudden feeling of nausea that, you know, everything just came back and it was more like you just knew. I was 100% sure that was him.
And when Nick also selects DeSilva from the same photo lineup, Detective Hudson brings 38-year-old Douglas DeSilva in for a closer look.
Mr. DeSilva, I'm Detective Doug Hudson.
Doug. We got the same first name, Doug.
We sure do.
He made so many bizarre and weird statements to us during the interview. There are probably too many to name.
Mr. DeSilva just finished his trooper application.
The application that Doug DeSilva filled out for the state police had stars drawn on it, had smiley faces drawn on it. The red flags went up after Nick told us about the smiley face drawn on his mom's back. With us finding the smiley face drawn on the state police application, of course, that puts things together. Led us to even feel stronger that he did this.
Based on DeSilva's odd behavior, his lack of an alibi, and Kay and Nick's photo identification of him, DeSilva is charged with rape and attempted murder. But even with her suspected attacker behind bars, Kay struggles to get past the trauma.
It affected everything. It affected my independence, my ability to feel safe.
Hey, you okay? Hey. Honey.
When life went back to normal for everybody else, I was still coping. So we would argue. Andrew, he didn't understand why time had passed and I hadn't recovered yet. So we finally ended up going separate ways.
The breakup is hard on Kay. She can only hope a trial against Doug Da Silva will finally bring the closure she so desperately needs. But after 15 months of waiting, the prosecutor delivers unexpected news just 3 days before the scheduled trial.
Da Silva is our guy.
Kay, I'm not quite sure how to tell you this. We just received this report from the FBI lab. They've been backlogged in their DNA testing. Doug Da Silva is not the man who attacked you.
What? I was floored, devastated. And I just didn't understand how that was possible.
How can this be?
We had the DNA checked 2 or 3 different more times to make sure there had not been a mistake. And it was clear there had not been a mistake.
No, I don't care what that piece of paper says. That man was in my home.
The same day, the charges against Douglas Da Silva are dropped and he's released from custody. For Kay, it's a bitter and surreal turn of events.
My first thoughts were somebody messed something up. They fouled the DNA, they lost the DNA, something's not right. He fits the physical description. He knew about the smiley face. It was horrible. Now I have to look over my shoulder, knowing he's out, knowing that he's most likely going to do this again to somebody else. So what was it all about? I thought that I had come through this to stop it from happening to someone else. You know, that I was strong enough to get through it and make sure that no one else was harmed by this person. And now they're letting him out.
Knowing her attacker is still out there and capable of striking again, Kay's no longer willing to take any chances.
I bought a home and I took all kinds of precautions to the extent of crazy. I did the security system, the gun. I had a .38 that had a fast load, so I was pretty efficient with the gun.
But Kay's planning doesn't stop there.
Information. Yes, can I have the number for Doug Da Silva? And also an address.
I was convinced that this was the man. And if he was going to be set free, then I was going to handle it. I was going to make sure he didn't do it again. I got babysitting for my son. I went to Lanham, Maryland. And when I got there, I had it all planned out.
She actually had the unfortunate thought of going to where Doug Da Silva lived and shooting him.
After the man she ID'd as her attacker is set free, Kay Robinson believes her only choice is to take matters into her own hands.
I wanted him to see me. I was just gonna knock on the door and say, "Do you remember me?" And I was gonna shoot him. And I was more than prepared to go to prison for the rest of my life. I was okay with that. But as I was sitting there, I got quickened, and all these thoughts were racing through my head. Who's going to raise your son? What about him? I eventually just pulled away and I went home. I'm very thankful that I didn't do that.
As years continue to pass, Kay does her best to accept that maybe Doug DeSilva isn't the man responsible, but that only brings new fears.
I kind of felt like, okay, if he didn't do it, there's still somebody out there. I've got to watch my back.
Hey, Mom? Can I please go outside and play?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, I had definitely moved on. Like, I had buried it, you know what I mean, already by then. But she dealt with it her own way, and I did my own way. You gotta keep going, you know what I mean? You can't stop living.
A staggering 10 years goes by since Kay's attack without any updates in the case.
You kind of take it personally because you think of yourself as a good investigator and you don't want to let Kay and her family down. I had been promoted and transferred to another job on the state police, and the case did go cold, but we always constantly worked on it.
Hey, Sarge. Detective. You got a minute?
Yeah, what's up?
You're gonna want to hear this.
There was a turn of events when police were given information about a man who had committed a crime in Maryland.
They got a guy named Mark Eskridge, tied him to a rape in 2002. Thing is, in 95, he lived in Delaware. Laurel, Delaware.
Laurel. Kay Robinson.
The similarities, how the crime was carried out against Kay, were staggeringly close.
There are a lot of different things that go through your mind as an investigator, but hopes went way up.
Hudson immediately sends DNA from Kay's case off for testing. While they wait for results, police revisit Kay's 1995 attack with this new information in mind.
Would you look at that? He had a direct line of sight. He could have been looking right into her bedroom window. How did we miss this guy?
Because we had Doug DeSilva.
Mark Eskridge lived there and basically was able to watch this investigation unfold and someone else be picked up and targeted as the person who did the crime. So he had to feel like he had committed the perfect crime and had nothing to worry about.
Soon, DNA confirms once and for all that Mark Eskridge is their man. Right away, they bring Kay Robinson in to share the good news. But her reaction isn't what they expect.
This looks nothing like the man that attacked me.
And when they showed me the photograph, I said, no, that's not him. I don't care if the DNA is a match or not, that's not him.
That's exactly what I thought when I saw it. Take a look at this one.
And they said, now we want you to look at another picture.
Oh my God.
And it was a photograph of what he looked like in '95. And DeSilva and Eskridge could have been twins.
I will always be baffled as to why Doug DeSilva put himself in the middle of it and maintained a presence like he did if he was an innocent man. But at that time, there was no question. The man who had attacked Kay was Mark Eskridge.
He lived right down the road from you, Kay. You'd never seen him before?
No.
Well, he definitely saw you.
We know now that Mark Eskridge went to Kay's house early that morning, knocked on her door.
He knew that Kay lived there, so he already had it planned out that he was going to get into that house.
He cut her throat in several different places. Stabbed her 25 to 30 times in the back. He thought she was dead, and he accomplished what he went there to do.
Somebody help, please!
But Kay is a very strong lady. She proved it to us just by surviving.
In January 2006, Mark Eskridge pleads guilty to rape and attempted murder and is sentenced to life plus 20 years in prison. Though it's taken a tremendous toll on them both, Kay and Nick have managed to put this incident behind them and move on with their lives.
I'm in a whole nother stage of my life now, you know what I mean? I'm raising kids now. Back then, I was a kid. No matter how long it is, you know what I mean, it does get better.
The only thing that's gotten me through this is family and friends and my faith. I tried so hard to get my life back to what it was until I finally realized I'm never going to get that back. I have to find out who I am now. I was so determined that I wasn't going to let him beat me.
Thank you for watching Investigation Discovery on Demand.
The blood was there for more than 3 decades. It was there in a Gary, Indiana apartment, in a case that seemed destined to disappear into the endless archive of American cold cases. It survived the passage of time. It survived changes in investigators, changes in technology, and years when the name John Thomas Curry was known mainly to the people who loved him and the detectives who refused to completely forget him. Then, in 2021, a laboratory test transformed what had been a mystery into something far more dangerous. A name emerged from evidence collected at the crime scene in 1991. And suddenly, 30 years of silence had a suspect. November 26, 1991. Gary, Indiana. The city had already endured decades of economic decline, violence, abandoned industrial spaces, and neighborhoods where people learned to be cautious after dark. But inside an apartment at 2054 Carolina Street, something far more personal and terrifying had happened. John Thomas Curry was 35 years old. By the time family members found him, he had already been stabbed multiple times. The apartment contained the remnants of a violent confrontation. Blood was not confined to a single location. Investigators documented evidence that appeared to lead from Curry's vehicle toward the living room. It was the kind of scene that immediately raised questions. Had the attack begun outside? Had Curry tried to escape? Had someone followed him inside? Was the killer known to him? Or had a stranger entered his life for reasons no one understood? There were no easy answers. And there was another problem. The killer appeared to have left behind something investigators could preserve, but not immediately identify. Blood. Dozens of samples were collected during the original investigation. Among them were several samples belonging to an unknown male. At the time, however, DNA technology was not what it would become decades later. A biological trace could be collected, cataloged, and stored without producing a name. The evidence could wait. The investigators could not. Years passed. The people who knew Curry grew older. Memories became less precise. Conversations that once centered on the murder became quieter. The case remained unresolved. Then technology caught up with the evidence. In January 2021, investigators with the Indiana State Police Laboratory revisited blood evidence connected to the homicide. The DNA profile was entered into the FBI's combined DNA index system, known as CODIS, and the system produced a result. The unknown male was no longer completely unknown. The name connected to the profile was Quentin Maurice Smith. Smith was not living in Gary. He was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He had a criminal history stretching back decades. His DNA had become available to investigators because of a later conviction. According to reporting based on the search warrant, Smith had been under Wisconsin supervision following a 2003 armed robbery conviction, which provided authorities with the reference DNA needed to make the comparison. The cold case had suddenly become active again. But DNA alone did not explain what happened to John Curry. It did not reveal why Smith would have been inside Curry's apartment. It did not explain the confrontation. It did not provide a motive. It did not answer the question that had haunted the case since 1991. Why John? Investigators went back through the old case file. They looked at evidence that had been collected before modern forensic technology could fully exploit it. They examined photographs, reports, statements, physical evidence. Every detail that had once seemed inconclusive could now carry new significance. The case was no longer simply an old homicide. It was an investigation happening across two different eras. One began in 1991, when the murder occurred. The other began 30 years later, when technology finally gave the evidence a voice. In October 2021, according to the search warrant, one of the previously unidentified male DNA samples from the scene was matched to Smith. That was the turning point. The investigators now had a biological connection between the suspect and evidence recovered from the apartment. But there was still a long road between a DNA match and a courtroom. The FBI's Gang Response Investigative Team, or GRIT, had begun re-examining the case in 2021. The team had been working on cold cases across the region, attempting to reopen investigations that had stalled years earlier. John Curry's case was one of them. For 30 years, the evidence had remained silent. Now it was pointing toward a man living in another state. On June 17, 2022, prosecutors in Lake County, Indiana, charged 50-year-old Quinton Maurice Smith with one count of murder. 4 days later, on June 21st, Smith was arrested in Milwaukee. The arrest came just as he had been discharged from parole. The distance between Gary and Milwaukee suddenly seemed meaningless. 31 years had collapsed into a single moment. A suspect had finally been identified. But identification is not the same as conviction, and an arrest is not the same as an answer. Authorities said Smith was accused of fatally stabbing Curry in 1991. He was awaiting extradition to Lake County, Indiana, after his arrest in Wisconsin. The announcement shocked those who had watched the case remain dormant for decades. A murder that once seemed frozen in 1991 had returned to the headlines. The phrase "cold case" suddenly appeared beside Curry's name again. But beneath the headlines was a much older story. A 35-year-old man had died inside his own home. His family had been the ones to find him. Someone had entered the apartment. Someone had fought with him. Someone had spilled blood. And someone had left the scene believing that the crime would remain hidden forever. For decades, that assumption appeared to be correct. Then a laboratory opened the past. The evidence did not forget. The blood did not forget. And after 31 years, the name investigators were searching for was finally attached to a living person. Yet one question remained suspended over the entire investigation. What actually happened inside that apartment on Carolina Street on November 26, 1991? The answer was buried somewhere between the physical evidence, the memories of those who knew Curry, and the silence that followed his death. And silence, in a cold case, can be deceptive. Because sometimes the most important witness is not a person. Sometimes it is a trace left behind by someone who thought no one would ever find it. For John Thomas Curry, that trace waited 30 years. And when it finally spoke, it changed everything. For 30 years, the apartment at 2054 Carolina Street remained frozen in time by a question no investigator could answer. Who had spilled the blood? The answer was not found in a confession. It was not discovered through a forgotten witness suddenly stepping forward. It did not come from a dramatic confrontation in an interrogation room. It came from a laboratory. That distinction matters. Because when investigators reopened John Thomas Curry's case in 2021, they were not starting with a clean slate. They were returning to evidence that had already been examined, documented, packaged, and stored decades earlier. The original detectives had done what they could with the technology available to them in 1991. But forensic science had changed dramatically since then. And somewhere inside those old evidence containers was a biological signature that had survived the years. John Curry's murder had happened on November 26, 1991. He was 35. Family members eventually found him inside his apartment on Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana. He had been stabbed multiple times. Investigators documented blood evidence inside and around the crime scene, including evidence that appeared to trace a path from Curry's vehicle toward the living room. Dozens of blood samples were collected. Among those samples were 8 that investigators associated with an unidentified male. 8 pieces of evidence. 8 biological traces belonging to someone whose identity had remained unknown. For years, that was all investigators had. An unknown male. No name. No face. No confirmed explanation. No courtroom. And no answer for Curry's family. Then came January 2021. The Indiana State Police laboratory tested blood evidence from the 1991 homicide. The results were entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a national database used to compare DNA profiles with profiles already held by law enforcement. The system searched. And somewhere inside that enormous database was a profile that changed the case. It pointed toward Quentin Maurice Smith. Smith was not a stranger to the criminal justice system. According to a search warrant later reported by Scripps News Milwaukee, Smith had been under Wisconsin Department of Corrections supervision following a 2003 armed robbery conviction. That conviction had placed his DNA into the system. But the initial connection was not the end of the investigation. It was the beginning. A database hit can give investigators a direction. It does not automatically explain how a person's DNA reached a crime scene. It does not automatically establish when it arrived. It does not automatically prove intent. And it certainly does not explain motive. So investigators kept working. The FBI's Gang Response Investigative Team, known as GRIT, began re-examining the case in 2021. The team worked alongside the Gary Police Department, the Lake County Police Department Crime Scene Unit, and Wisconsin authorities. Old evidence was suddenly new again. Every blood sample could be reconsidered. Every report could be reread. Every detail could be measured against what the DNA now appeared to show. The investigation had become a bridge between two worlds. One world belonged to 1991. The other belonged to modern forensic science. And between them stood a dead man whose family had waited 3 decades for an explanation. Then, in October 2021, the search warrant indicated that one of the previously unidentified male DNA samples from the crime scene matched Smith. The unknown male finally had a name. Quentin Maurice Smith. That moment must have changed the atmosphere inside the investigation. For 30 years, the case had been a question. Now it had a person attached to it. But the deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the timeline became. Smith was living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Curry had been killed in Gary, Indiana. The two cities were separated by distance, but not by an impossible distance. The case suddenly demanded a new set of questions. Had Smith known Curry? Had he been inside the apartment before? Why was his blood allegedly among the evidence? Was the DNA left during the fatal confrontation? Was it the result of an injury? Had the two men fought? What brought Smith to Carolina Street that night? And perhaps most importantly, what happened during the final moments of John Thomas Curry's life? The public record released by the FBI did not provide a motive. That absence is significant. Investigators had a biological connection, but the reason behind the alleged killing remained unclear. The original crime scene still held the key. Curry's blood, the unknown man's blood, the path through the apartment, the physical evidence preserved from a night that had otherwise disappeared into history. A crime scene can be silent for decades, but silence does not necessarily mean emptiness. Evidence can remain. And sometimes, evidence becomes more powerful as technology improves. In 1991, a bloodstain might have been little more than a documented stain. 30 years later, it could become a genetic profile. A genetic profile could become a database hit. A database hit could become an investigative lead. An investigative lead could become an arrest. That chain is what transformed Curry's case. But there was something else that made the development so striking. The alleged killer had not been identified through a dramatic confession. He had not walked into a police station. He had not been recognized by a witness decades later. According to investigators, he had been identified because his DNA had already entered the criminal justice system for another case. The past had connected itself to the present. And suddenly, a murder committed in 1991 had become relevant to a man living in Wisconsin in 2022. For the people following cold cases, it was a reminder of something detectives have learned repeatedly. Time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes it gives investigators better tools to understand it. By the spring of 2022, investigators had enough to move forward. On June 17, 2022, Quentin Maurice Smith was charged in Lake County Superior Court with 1 count of murder in connection with Curry's death. He was 50 years old. The victim had been 35. The difference between those two ages represented more than a decade of life that had passed between the crime and the accusation. Curry never received those years. Smith lived them. He moved through the world. He accumulated a criminal history. He eventually came under parole supervision. And then, more than 30 years after the stabbing, his name surfaced in a homicide investigation that had been dormant since 1991. On June 21st, investigators with the FBI Milwaukee Area Violent Crimes Task Force and GRID arrested Smith in Milwaukee. The timing was striking. Smith had just been discharged from parole. The arrest came in Wisconsin, but the case belonged to Indiana. He was awaiting extradition to Lake County. The geography of the case suddenly stretched across state lines. Gary. Milwaukee. Indiana. Wisconsin. 2 cities. 2 decades of history. 1 DNA profile. 1 murder charge. And 1 family still waiting for the full story. The FBI announcement on June 22nd made the development public. After 31 years, the name of a suspect could finally be attached to John Curry's murder. But investigators were careful about what they actually had. A charge is an accusation. An arrest is not a conviction. A DNA match can be powerful evidence, but the circumstances surrounding that evidence still matter. And because the original crime occurred so long ago, investigators had to reconstruct a case from fragments. The scene had been processed in 1991. The witnesses had aged. Some memories may have faded. Some people connected to Curry may no longer have been alive. Documents had accumulated dust. Evidence had spent decades inside storage facilities. And yet, one thing remained remarkably intact. The biological evidence. That was the bridge. That was the thread. And investigators pulled it carefully. The case now entered a new phase. It was no longer simply about identifying an unknown person. It was about proving what happened. That distinction would become critical. Because there is a vast difference between knowing whose DNA is present and knowing precisely what happened during a homicide. The DNA could answer one question. Whose biological material was there? But another question remained. Why? Why was Smith allegedly there? What relationship existed between Smith and Curry? What triggered the violence? Was the killing planned? Was it spontaneous? Was there an argument? Was there a confrontation? Was robbery involved? Or was the motive something that had disappeared with the people who knew the 2 men? The FBI's public statement did not provide those answers. It simply described the result of the renewed investigation. DNA evidence had identified Smith as a suspect. That was enough to reopen a case that had survived 3 decades. But it was not enough to erase every mystery surrounding Curry's death. The night of November 26, 1991, remained largely hidden. The exact sequence of events remained a matter for investigators and prosecutors. The apartment remained the center of the story. A vehicle, a trail of blood, a living room, a victim, an unknown male, and decades later, a name. For the first time since 1991, investigators could look at the evidence and ask questions about a specific person. That is what made the case so unsettling. The killer, if the accusation was ultimately proven, had not been hiding behind an unknowable identity forever. He had been living somewhere, breathing, aging, moving through ordinary days, while John Curry's name remained attached to a murder file. For years, the case may have seemed like one of those investigations destined to remain permanently unsolved. But cold cases have a strange quality. They can appear dead while remaining alive underneath the surface. Evidence waits. Databases expand. Technology improves. Investigators change. And sometimes, decades after the crime, a machine compares two profiles that were never meant to meet. That is what happened here. A blood sample collected in 1991 was eventually connected to a DNA profile in a modern law enforcement database. The connection led investigators to Quentin Maurice Smith. The connection led to a charge. The charge led to an arrest. And the arrest brought the case back into public view. But the most important part of the story was still missing. John Thomas Curry had a life before he became a crime scene. He had relationships. He had family. He had ordinary days that existed outside the photographs and police reports. On November 26, 1991, that ordinary life ended violently. 31 years later, investigators finally had a suspect. Yet for Curry's family, a suspect was not the same thing as closure. Closure would require the truth. The truth about the confrontation. The truth about the blood. The truth about what happened inside that apartment. And the truth about why John Thomas Curry never walked out alive. Those answers had been buried for more than 3 decades. Now, for the first time, investigators had a biological trail leading back toward them. And somewhere at the end of that trail was a night in Gary that had never truly ended. Because every cold case carries the same terrifying possibility. The person responsible may disappear. The witnesses may forget. The headlines may fade. But the evidence can wait. And in John Thomas Curry's case, it waited 31 years. Then it spoke. The arrest answered one question that had remained unanswered for 3 decades. But it created another. What happened next? For investigators, the discovery of Quentin Maurice Smith's DNA at the scene was not the end of John Thomas Curry's story. It was the moment the old case had to be reconstructed from the beginning. Every detail mattered now. The date. The apartment. The blood. The vehicle. The location of each sample. The identity of the victim. And the possibility that somewhere inside the original investigation was a detail that had been overlooked simply because investigators in 1991 did not yet possess the technology available 3 decades later. John Thomas Curry had died on November 26, 1991. He was 35 years old. His death had occurred inside an apartment at 2054 Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana. The city was familiar with violence, but that did not make Curry's death any less shocking to those who knew him. A homicide in a neighborhood can become a headline for a day. Then the television cameras leave. Police tape disappears. People return to work. Children return to school. Traffic moves again. But for a victim's family, the clock stops. Every unanswered question remains fixed to the same date. November 26th, 1991. And for Curry's family, there was no person to confront. No suspect to watch in court. No explanation of why the attack happened. Only an empty space where an answer should have been. The original investigators collected evidence from the apartment. They documented blood. They preserved samples. They attempted to reconstruct the violence. But forensic science has never been static. What could not be identified in 1991 could potentially be identified in 2021. That difference is enormous. In the early 1990s, DNA evidence was already being used in criminal investigations, but the national databases and sophisticated forensic systems that investigators rely upon today were still developing. A sample could be collected and preserved even when it could not immediately produce a name. That is exactly why evidence preservation became so important. The evidence did not need to solve the murder that year. It only needed to survive. And it did. For nearly 30 years, those biological traces remained part of the case file. Then the case was reopened. Investigators with the Indiana State Police Laboratory returned to the evidence. The samples were analyzed. A male DNA profile was developed. The profile was entered into CODIS. The database searched for a corresponding profile. And eventually, the search pointed toward Smith. But there is an uncomfortable truth about forensic breakthroughs. A DNA match can identify a person. It cannot tell a complete story. It cannot automatically reveal what a person was thinking. It cannot tell investigators whether a person entered a room voluntarily or under threat. It cannot, by itself, explain the circumstances surrounding the presence of biological material. Those questions still require traditional police work. That meant detectives had to go backward. They had to revisit the crime. Not merely the DNA. The entire crime. The FBI's gang response investigative team became involved in the renewed investigation. The team worked with local authorities and other agencies as investigators tried to understand what had happened 3 decades earlier. The old case was no longer being treated as a forgotten file. It was being treated as an active homicide investigation. And that meant the smallest details could become important again. Investigators had to look at what the original detectives had seen. They had to examine what had been recorded. They had to consider whether old statements could be corroborated by modern evidence. They had to determine what the biological evidence actually demonstrated. And they had to build a timeline. A timeline is often the backbone of a homicide investigation. Someone sees the victim alive. Then something changes. A vehicle arrives. A door opens. A confrontation begins. Blood is spilled. A person leaves. A body is discovered. Every minute matters. But in Curry's case, the investigators were trying to reconstruct that timeline more than 30 years after the fact. That creates enormous challenges. People remember events differently. Memories fade. Details disappear. Some witnesses may no longer be available. Neighborhoods change. Buildings change. Records become harder to locate. And yet the physical evidence remains stubbornly indifferent to time. Blood does not remember. DNA does not remember. But both can preserve information. That was the power of the evidence connected to Curry's case. Among the samples collected from the scene were 8 samples associated with an unidentified male. For years, those samples represented an unanswered question. Who was the man? The renewed investigation finally produced a name. Quentin Maurice Smith. According to investigators, one of the previously unidentified male DNA samples was matched to Smith in October 2021. The implications were immediate. Investigators now had to determine whether the DNA was consistent with the circumstances of Curry's death. They had to consider the location, the nature of the biological evidence, the other evidence in the apartment, and any potential connection between Smith and Curry. The investigation had become a search for context. Because the most powerful question was no longer simply, whose DNA is this? It was, why was it here? That question is at the center of almost every forensic homicide investigation. A fingerprint can tell investigators someone touched something. DNA can tell investigators that biological material associated with a person was present. But the circumstances determine what those findings mean. That is why investigators do not simply stop when a database produces a name. They keep digging. And the digging eventually led authorities toward an arrest. On June 17, 2022, Smith was charged with murder in Lake County, Indiana. 4 days later, on June 21st, he was arrested in Milwaukee. The arrest was carried out by the FBI Milwaukee Area Violent Crimes Task Force and the FBI's GRIT team. Smith was 50 years old. The victim had been dead for 31 years. The passage of time made the arrest extraordinary. But it also made the case more difficult. A prosecution based on a decades-old homicide requires investigators to explain events that occurred before many modern investigative tools existed. There were no smartphones documenting movements, no widespread surveillance camera network, no modern digital trail capable of tracking a person's location minute by minute. There was no social media record showing who was communicating with whom. The investigators had to work with the world of 1991. Paper, telephone records, physical evidence, human memory, and blood. That made the DNA breakthrough even more significant. The evidence had crossed the technological divide. A sample collected in the early 1990s had survived long enough to be tested using modern forensic methods. The investigation had effectively reached backward through time. But while the public saw the arrest as a dramatic development, Curry's family had to confront something much more complicated. For 31 years, the unknown person responsible for John's death had been an unanswered question. Now there was a name, a face, a criminal charge, a real person who could be brought before a court. That can bring hope. But it can also bring painful memories back to the surface. A cold case can become part of a family's identity. Years pass. Birthday arrive. Holidays come and go. Children grow up. People move. But the victim remains frozen at the age of death. John Curry remained 35. The world around him changed. His family changed. The technology changed. The investigators changed. But the question remained. Who killed John Thomas Curry? For decades, there was no answer. Then the DNA provided one possible answer. But a legal system demands more than suspicion. It demands evidence. It demands procedure. It demands that accusations be tested. And that is where the story moves from the laboratory to the courtroom. The arrest itself did not erase the uncertainty surrounding the case. It did not reveal a motive. It did not recreate the final moments inside the apartment. It did not tell the public exactly what happened between Curry and the man whose DNA investigators say was found at the scene. Those questions remained. And they mattered. Because the story of a homicide is never complete when a suspect is identified. The identity of a suspect is only one piece of the puzzle. The real story lies in the sequence. What brought the people together? What happened before the violence? What happened during it? What happened immediately afterward? And why did the person responsible believe they could walk away? For 31 years, investigators had no name to attach to those questions. Now they did. But the passage of time had created another mystery. Why had the case remained unsolved for so long? The answer was not necessarily that investigators had stopped caring. Sometimes a cold case survives because the evidence is incomplete. Sometimes the technology is not available. Sometimes witnesses disappear. Sometimes the person responsible leaves no usable lead. And sometimes the most important piece of evidence is sitting inside an evidence locker waiting for science to catch up. Curry's case appeared to contain exactly that kind of evidence. A biological trace that had no name in 1991. A DNA profile that eventually had a name in 2021. And a murder charge in 2022. That progression transformed a forgotten case into one of the clearest examples of how forensic technology can revive an investigation long after the original detectives have left the scene. But technology could only open the door. Investigators still had to walk through it. They had to establish what happened inside that apartment. They had to understand the relationship, if any, between the victim and the accused. They had to determine how the blood came to be there. And they had to confront the central question that had remained buried since that November night. Was this the moment John Curry's killer finally made a mistake? Or had the killer been leaving evidence behind all along? The answer had been sitting in storage, waiting, silent, invisible to everyone except the future. Then the future arrived. 31 years after John Thomas Curry was killed, the evidence was tested again. The DNA spoke. And the man whose name emerged from that evidence was no longer an anonymous figure. He was Quentin Maurice Smith. But the DNA had only opened the door. Behind that door was the rest of the story. And for the first time in 3 decades, investigators were finally able to step inside. The apartment was no longer simply a place where a man had died. It had become a map of blood, a map of movement, a map of unanswered questions. For investigators reopening the case, the physical evidence from 1991 was no longer just historical material. It was potentially the closest thing they had to a witness that had survived the decades. John Thomas Curry was dead, but the evidence remained. That distinction became increasingly important as detectives reconstructed the case. The original investigation had produced numerous blood samples. 8 of them were associated with an unidentified male. For years, that male existed only as a forensic profile without a name. Then modern testing changed the equation. Quentin Maurice Smith was identified through DNA. But once investigators had a name, the case became more complicated, not less. A name creates questions. Where was he in November 1991? Did he know Curry? Had anyone seen the 2 men together? Did anyone remember Smith and Gary? Was there a connection between Smith and the apartment? Was the DNA deposited during the fatal confrontation? Or was there another explanation? Every possibility had to be examined. The investigators were no longer searching blindly. They were searching around a specific person. That is a dramatically different investigation. Instead of asking whether the killer might be one of thousands of unknown individuals, investigators could now examine the history and movements of one identified suspect. But 31 years had passed. That amount of time can erase evidence in ways no laboratory can reverse. Buildings change. Neighbors move. Relationships end. People die. Documents disappear. Memory becomes uncertain. A witness who was 20 years old in 1991 could be over 50 in 2022. Someone who remembered a face perfectly in 1991 might struggle to recognize that same person 3 decades later. And yet investigators continued. The FBI's Gang Response Investigative Team had been created to assist with violent crime investigations. In Curry's case, the team helped bring additional resources to a homicide that had remained unresolved for years. The case moved forward, but the public record remained limited. And that silence created another layer of mystery. Because the most dramatic development was known. DNA had connected Smith to evidence from the scene. Smith had been charged. Smith had been arrested. But the full narrative of the killing was still not publicly reconstructed. There was no detailed confession. No public courtroom revelation explaining every minute of the night. No simple motive that could make the violence understandable. There was only the evidence. And the evidence pointed backward. Back to 1991. Back to Carolina Street. Back to the apartment. Back to John Curry. A cold case is often described as something frozen. But Curry's case was not truly frozen. It was accumulating time. Every year added another layer. 1992. 1993. 1994. The years kept moving. The case file remained. The unanswered questions remained. Then the 21st century arrived. Technology accelerated. DNA databases expanded. Forensic laboratories became more sophisticated. And evidence that once produced only an unidentified profile could now potentially be compared against millions of records. That technological transformation changed the meaning of old evidence. A blood sample from 1991 was no longer simply a blood sample. It was a potential identity, a potential connection, a potential lead, and eventually it became one. In October 2021, investigators linked an unidentified male DNA sample from the crime scene to Smith. The investigation had crossed a threshold, but detectives knew that identifying a person was not enough. They needed to establish the circumstances. They needed to understand how Smith's biological material came to exist inside the crime scene. That question is crucial because a DNA profile does not come with a timestamp. The biological material can identify a person. The rest of the investigation has to establish when and why it was deposited. In a homicide case, that distinction can determine everything. Investigators, therefore, had to return to the old facts. Curry's body, the apartment, the vehicle, the blood patterns, the original reports, the witnesses, the surrounding circumstances. The entire case had to be examined again. And that process can be painfully slow. A cold case investigation does not move like a television episode. There is no convenient answer waiting in the next room. There are no perfect witnesses. There is no guarantee that every missing piece will be recovered. Instead, investigators assemble fragments. One report, one sample, one interview, one database search, one connection, one inconsistency, then another. The objective is to build a chain strong enough to explain what happened. For John Curry, the first major link had finally appeared. DNA. Then came the legal action. On June 17, 2022, prosecutors charged Quinton Maurice Smith with murder. The charge transformed the investigation from a forensic inquiry into a criminal case. 4 days later, Smith was arrested in Milwaukee. He was 50 years old. Curry had been dead for 31 years. The arrest was carried out by federal and local investigators working together. The case had crossed state lines. Indiana investigators were pursuing a homicide that had led them to Wisconsin, and the suspect was being held while awaiting extradition to Lake County. The distance between the crime and the arrest was more than geographical. It was temporal. 31 years. 3 decades of ordinary life occurring between the crime and the moment investigators placed Smith under arrest. For the public, that passage of time made the story extraordinary. For Curry's family, it likely represented something far more complicated. The sudden return of the case, the reopening of old memories, the possibility of a courtroom, the possibility of finally hearing evidence presented in public, but also the realization that the man accused of killing John had lived for decades after the alleged crime. That is one of the most difficult realities in a cold case. The victim remains permanently connected to the date of death. The accused continues living. Years become decades. The world changes. The victim does not. Curry's name remained in the case file. His age remained 35. His death remained November 26, 1991. But the man accused in the case grew older. By the time of his arrest, Smith was 50. The passage of time had not erased the alleged connection. It had only delayed its discovery. And this is where the story of DNA becomes almost unsettling. DNA does not care how much time has passed. It does not care whether a case has been forgotten. It does not care whether the original detective has retired. It does not care whether the suspect moved to another state. If the biological material remains usable, the evidence can wait. That is exactly what makes old forensic evidence so powerful. The crime may be decades old. The evidence is not necessarily obsolete. It may simply be waiting for better science. The Curry investigation demonstrated that principle in the most dramatic way. A sample collected in the early 1990s eventually helped investigators identify a suspect more than 3 decades later. The case had survived because someone preserved the evidence. And that preservation gave the future an opportunity to answer a question the past could not. But even with that breakthrough, the mystery was not completely gone. The public still needed to understand the circumstances. Why did Curry die? What was the relationship between the victim and the accused? What caused the confrontation? What happened immediately before the stabbing? What happened afterward? And what happened during the years when no one knew who the unidentified male was? These were not minor details. They were the heart of the case. Because a murder investigation does not end when a name appears in a database. That is where the real investigation begins. The DNA had pointed toward a person. Now investigators had to determine whether every other piece of evidence supported the same conclusion. They had to examine the physical evidence, the timeline, the witness accounts, the suspect's history, the circumstances surrounding the scene, and the unanswered questions from 1991. The case had become a conversation between 2 generations of investigators. The detectives who worked the original homicide had asked questions without the benefit of modern DNA databases. The new investigators asked the same questions with new evidence. Sometimes that is how cold cases are solved, not because someone suddenly discovers an entirely new clue, but because an old clue finally becomes understandable. A stain becomes a profile becomes a name becomes an investigation becomes an arrest, and an arrest forces the past back into the present. That was the path of John Thomas Curry's case. But the deeper investigators went, the more obvious one fact became. The DNA could tell them who had allegedly left biological material behind. It could not tell them everything John Curry experienced during his final moments. That story remained trapped inside the apartment, somewhere in those walls, somewhere in the blood evidence, somewhere in the memories of people who had known Curry, and perhaps somewhere in the mind of the man investigators had finally identified. For 31 years, there had been no answer. Now there was a suspect. But a suspect was only the beginning. Because the most haunting question had never been simply who. It was why. Why did John Thomas Curry's life end that night? Why did the violence happen? Why did the person responsible leave blood behind? And why did it take more than 3 decades for that blood to finally reveal a name? The evidence had waited. The case had waited. John Curry's family had waited. Now the investigation had returned to the beginning. November 26, 1991. Gary, Indiana. A 35-year-old man. An apartment on Carolina Street. A violent death. And a trail of biological evidence that would eventually reach across 31 years and 2 states. The past had finally caught up with the present. But the final truth was still somewhere ahead. The hardest part of a cold case is not always finding the evidence. Sometimes it is understanding what the evidence means. For John Thomas Curry's investigators, the DNA breakthrough had transformed an unidentified biological profile into the name of Quentin Maury Smith. But the moment that name appeared, the investigation entered a far more demanding stage. Now every piece of the past had to be tested against the present. The question was no longer simply whether Smith's DNA had been recovered. The question was whether the evidence could explain the murder. Because inside a courtroom, every detail matters. Where was the biological material found? How was it collected? How was it preserved? How was the DNA profile developed? How was the comparison performed? And what other evidence supported the investigators' theory of what happened? Those questions become especially important when a case is more than 3 decades old. The original investigators could not have known what future technology would make possible. They were working in 1991. They had a crime scene. They had a victim. They had blood. They had reports. They had questions. But they did not have the answer. The unidentified male profile remained just that. Unidentified. And as the years passed, the profile became a silent piece of the case. Then, decades later, Cody's gave it a potential identity. That development changed the entire direction of the investigation. But it also forced investigators to look at the case through a different lens. If Smith was connected to the biological evidence, what did that mean in the context of the crime? The answer could not simply be assumed. Investigators needed to establish the circumstances surrounding the evidence. That is why cold case detectives often return to the crime scene mentally, even when the physical scene no longer exists as it did on the night of the homicide. They reconstruct it through photographs, reports, measurements, statements, evidence logs, laboratory results. Every document becomes a fragment of a picture. And in Curry's case, those fragments stretched back to November 26, 1991. A date that had remained fixed while everything around it changed. Gary had changed. The neighborhood had changed. Technology had changed. The people connected to the case had changed. But the victim remained exactly where the investigation had left him. 35 years old. Dead. Inside an apartment on Carolina Street. That permanence is one of the cruelest elements of homicide. The world continues. The victim does not. For Curry's family, there was no possibility of simply moving beyond the date. There could be other birthdays, other holidays, other family gatherings. But November 26th would always carry the weight of the unanswered question. Who killed John? For years, there was no name. Then investigators found one. But even a name can create another kind of uncertainty. Because an accusation brings the past back into the present. Suddenly, people may remember conversations they had forgotten. Places they had not visited in years. Names they had not spoken aloud. And investigators begin asking questions that might have seemed irrelevant 30 years earlier. Did anyone know Smith? Did anyone see him around Curry's apartment? Did anyone remember Curry's movements during the hours before his death? Did anyone notice an unfamiliar vehicle? Did anyone hear an argument? Did anyone see someone leave? Did anyone hear something unusual? These are the questions that can turn a DNA lead into a complete case. But time makes answers difficult. A witness who might once have remembered a precise detail could now remember only fragments. A person may remember a face, but not a name. A location may have changed. A conversation may have disappeared from memory. And sometimes the people who could have answered the questions are no longer alive. That is the brutal arithmetic of a 31-year investigation. Every year creates distance. But the DNA evidence created a different kind of connection. It did not depend on memory. It depended on biology. A sample collected in the early 1990s could still carry information in the 21st century. That information did not fade because the case had gone cold. It simply waited. The investigators who reopened Curry's murder understood the significance of that. The case had not been solved by time. It had been reopened by technology. And technology gave detectives something the original investigation had lacked. A direction. The direction led to Wisconsin. Smith was living in Milwaukee. That meant investigators had to cross state lines to continue the case. The murder had occurred in Indiana. The suspect was located in Wisconsin. More than 3 decades separated the 2 points in time. The case had become interstate, as well as historical. Then came June 2022. The investigation reached a public turning point. Smith was charged with murder in Lake County. The accusation was no longer confined to an investigative file. It had entered the legal system. Days later, Smith was arrested in Milwaukee by authorities working through the FBI Milwaukee Area Violent Crimes Task Force in Grit. The image of a man being arrested in 2022 for a murder alleged to have occurred in 1991 captures something deeply unsettling about cold cases. The past can remain dormant, but it does not necessarily disappear. For investigators, the arrest represented progress. For Curry's family, it represented the possibility that the silence surrounding John's death might finally be broken. But the word possibility matters. An arrest does not establish guilt. A criminal charge is an allegation. The evidence must still be tested through the legal process. And that distinction is essential in a case built around a decades-old investigation. The DNA connection was significant, but the entire case still had to be examined. That meant returning to the evidence collected before modern investigators knew where it would eventually lead. The old blood samples became central. The unidentified male profile that had once been an investigative dead end was now linked to a person. That single transformation illustrates the strange nature of forensic science. The evidence itself did not necessarily change. The ability to interpret it did. What was once inconclusive could become meaningful. What was once anonymous could become identifiable. And what was once a closed file could become an active homicide investigation. That is why the preservation of evidence matters so much. A crime scene can be cleaned. A building can be renovated. A neighborhood can change. But properly preserved evidence can survive all of it. Curry's case is a reminder that investigators sometimes have to think beyond the technology of their own era. They cannot always know which evidence will matter decades later. A blood sample that seems limited today may become decisive tomorrow. A fingerprint may eventually be matched. A digital record may be recovered. A new database may contain the missing connection. Science changes. Cases can change with it. But science cannot tell investigators everything. DNA can identify. It can connect. It can exclude. It can establish a biological relationship to evidence. But it cannot automatically provide a motive. It cannot describe an argument that no one recorded. It cannot explain the emotional state of two people standing inside an apartment in 1991. It cannot tell investigators what was said immediately before the violence. Those details belong to the human side of the investigation. And that is where the mystery surrounding John Curry's death remained. There was still a human story hidden behind the forensic evidence. Who was John Curry in the days before his death? What was happening in his life? Who did he trust? Who knew where he lived? Who could enter his apartment without raising suspicion? And what brought the alleged killer into his orbit? These questions are often more difficult than identifying a DNA profile. A profile is mathematical. A motive is human. And human motives can disappear into the past. Jealousy. Money. Revenge. Fear. Opportunity. Anger. A personal dispute. A chance encounter. Or something investigators had not yet uncovered. Without the complete picture, the murder remains disturbing precisely because the final explanation is incomplete. The public knows that Curry died violently. The public knows that biological evidence from the scene was eventually associated with Smith. The public knows that prosecutors charged Smith in 2022. But the passage from those facts to a complete reconstruction of the murder requires evidence beyond headlines. It requires the painstaking work of investigators and prosecutors. That work is rarely dramatic. There are no flashing lights, no dramatic music, no sudden confession. There are interviews, laboratory reports, court documents, evidence reviews, old photographs, new comparisons, hours of research, days spent trying to understand something that happened before many people involved in the investigation had even entered the profession. That is the reality behind a cold case. The breakthrough may take seconds. The investigation that follows can take years. And for Curry's case, the breakthrough came after 30 years of waiting. The DNA match was the spark. The arrest was the consequence. But the truth remained the objective. Because the family did not need merely a suspect. They needed an explanation. They needed to know what happened to John. They needed to know why his life ended in that apartment. And they needed to know whether the person accused of taking that life could ultimately be held responsible in court. Those questions cannot be answered by a headline. They must be answered by evidence. And evidence has its own pace. It moves slowly. It demands verification. It survives challenge. It must withstand scrutiny. That is what makes the story of John Thomas Curry so haunting. For 31 years, the case seemed to belong to the past. Then one biological trace carried it into the future. A blood sample collected in 1991 became a DNA profile. The profile entered a database. The database produced a lead. The lead became an investigation. The investigation became a murder charge. And the charge led investigators to a man living hundreds of miles away. Yet despite everything that had changed, one fact remained exactly the same. John Thomas Curry was still dead. No DNA test could change that. No arrest could give him back the years he lost. No courtroom could erase the violence of that November night. But the discovery could accomplish something else. It could give his name a place in an investigation that had finally moved again. For decades, the case had been a question mark. Now it was a living legal case. And somewhere between the old evidence and the new investigation was the answer that had escaped everyone since 1991. The evidence had survived. The investigators had returned. The name had been found. But the story of what happened to John Thomas Curry was still waiting to be completely told. And after 31 years, the silence was finally beginning to break. The silence surrounding John Thomas Curry's murder had lasted so long that it had become part of the case itself. 31 years. Long enough for a child to become an adult. Long enough for a neighborhood to change. Long enough for investigators who first stood inside the apartment to retire. Long enough for the technology of criminal investigation to transform completely. And yet the central question remained untouched. What happened to John Curry on November 26, 1991? The renewed investigation could finally place a name beside the unidentified male DNA profile. But a name was only the beginning. Now investigators had to reconstruct a night that had vanished into the past. The first challenge was time. A homicide investigated immediately after the event has one enormous advantage. The witnesses remember. The physical surroundings are intact. The victim's recent activities can be traced. Telephone calls can be examined. Neighbors may remember unusual sounds. Friends can describe recent conversations. Investigators can ask questions while the answers are still fresh. Curry's case had none of those advantages when the investigation was reopened. 30 years had passed. The world had moved on. The people who knew Curry in 1991 had lived entire lives since then. Some may have moved away. Some may have forgotten details. Others may have remembered something only after seeing the case return to the news. That is one of the strangest characteristics of cold cases. A forgotten memory can suddenly become important. A name that meant nothing for decades can suddenly become a potential lead. A location that was once familiar can become difficult to recognize. And a piece of evidence that seemed insignificant can suddenly become central. For investigators, the DNA evidence provided something that memory could not. A biological connection. The Indiana State Police Laboratory had analyzed evidence from the original homicide. The profile associated with an unidentified male was entered into Cody's. The database searched. Then the system produced a connection to Quentin Maurice Smith. That connection gave investigators something they had not possessed for decades. A starting point. Smith's DNA could now be compared against the original evidence and the circumstances documented at the scene. The investigation could move from an unknown offender toward a specific suspect. But the deeper question remained. How did Smith become connected to John Curry? The answer was not obvious from the public record. And that absence is important. A murder does not become understandable simply because investigators identify someone whose biological material is associated with the crime scene. The relationship between the people involved still has to be established. Investigators must ask whether they knew each other, whether they had met before, whether there had been conflict, whether there was a financial dispute, whether there was a personal dispute, whether the encounter was planned, or whether two lives crossed unexpectedly and violently. Those possibilities can lead an investigation in completely different directions. But the crime scene itself remains the starting point. The blood, the apartment, the vehicle, the location of the evidence, the condition of the scene. These details create the physical framework of the crime. Investigators in 1991 had already documented those elements. The renewed investigation could now reinterpret them using modern forensic knowledge. That is one of the most powerful aspects of cold case work. The original evidence does not necessarily need to change. The questions change. In 1991, investigators might ask, "Whose blood is this?" Decades later, they can ask, "Does this blood produce a DNA profile?" Then another question. Does that profile match anyone in a database? Then another. If it matches, does the rest of the evidence support the connection? The questions become increasingly specific. The mystery narrows. The unknown becomes a person. And once there is a person, investigators can begin rebuilding a timeline around that individual. That is what happened when Smith's name emerged. His criminal history became relevant. His location became relevant. His movements became relevant. His previous contact with the justice system became relevant because that was how investigators ultimately obtained the reference DNA necessary to make the comparison. The connection was not created in 2021. The biological evidence had existed since 1991. What changed was the ability to compare it with a known profile. That is the difference between evidence and information. The evidence was always there. The information came later. And that distinction explains why so many cold cases remain potentially solvable. A case can appear exhausted while its evidence is still capable of producing new information. Curry's case had waited for that moment. Then the legal system moved. On June 17, 2022, Smith was charged with murder in Lake County, Indiana. 4 days later, he was arrested in Milwaukee. The arrest represented a dramatic change. For decades, Curry's homicide had been a question without a publicly identified suspect. Now investigators had someone they believed could be responsible. But the arrest also brought the case into a new and more demanding stage. The evidence would have to survive scrutiny. The allegations would have to be tested. The prosecution would have to establish its case. And the defense would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence. That is the difference between an investigative breakthrough and a judicial conclusion. One identifies a direction. The other requires proof. For the people who had waited for answers, that distinction could feel frustrating. But it is essential. A cold case cannot be solved simply because the story seems to make sense. Investigators must demonstrate how the evidence fits together. They must show that the DNA evidence is reliable. They must establish how it was collected. They must document its chain of custody. They must explain the laboratory analysis. They must connect the forensic evidence to the circumstances of the homicide. And they must account for alternative explanations. Every piece matters. That is especially true when the evidence is more than 30 years old. The age of the evidence can become both its greatest weakness and its greatest strength. Weakness, because memories fade and records may disappear. Strength, because properly preserved biological evidence can remain extraordinarily useful. That is what makes the Curry case so compelling. The investigators did not need to invent new evidence. They needed to extract new information from old evidence. And the information pointed toward Smith. Still, the murder itself remained a human mystery. John Curry had a life before that night. He was more than a name in a homicide report. He was a son, a relative, a friend, a person with routines and relationships that existed before the violence. Those details can disappear from public memory when a case remains unsolved for decades. The longer a case stays cold, the more the victim risks becoming nothing more than a photograph attached to an old headline. That is one of the quiet tragedies of unsolved homicide. The crime remains visible. The person disappears. But reopening a case can reverse that process. It can bring the victim's name back into the public record. It can force investigators to look again. It can remind people that the passage of time does not erase the value of a human life. For Curry's family, the renewed investigation meant that his death was no longer sitting untouched in the past. Someone was looking again. Someone was testing evidence again. Someone was asking questions again. And this time, the investigators had something the original team had never possessed: a DNA connection. The question now became whether that connection could illuminate the rest of the night. The exact sequence of events remained crucial. At some point, Curry was alive. At some point, a confrontation occurred. At some point, blood was shed. At some point, the person responsible left. And at some point, Curry's family discovered what had happened. The gap between those moments contained the entire murder. That gap was what investigators needed to fill. But time had buried much of it. The apartment could no longer speak. The people involved could provide only whatever remained in their memories. The evidence could provide fragments. And fragments are rarely enough by themselves. They must be assembled. That is the work of detectives. One fact at a time. One comparison at a time. One interview at a time. One laboratory result at a time. The process can take months, sometimes years. And in a cold case, investigators are constantly aware that every unanswered question has already survived decades. The Curry investigation had already waited 31 years. There was no reason to pretend that the remaining answers would come easily. The DNA had opened the door. But beyond that door was a much larger mystery. Why was Smith allegedly there? What happened between the two men? Was the violence sudden? Was it deliberate? Was something taken? Was something discovered? Was there an argument? Or was the reason hidden somewhere in the personal histories of the victim and the accused? Those questions were not answered simply by a DNA database. They required human investigation. And that was precisely where the case stood after the arrest. The identity of a suspect had emerged from evidence that had been silent since 1991. The investigation had crossed state lines. The legal system had become involved. But the night itself remained trapped in the past. For 31 years, John Curry's final hours had been a blank space. Now investigators had begun filling that space. Slowly, carefully, piece by piece. And somewhere inside those fragments was the explanation for why a 35-year-old man never made it beyond November 26, 1991. The blood had survived. The DNA had survived. The case had survived. And now, after 3 decades of silence, investigators were finally forcing the past to speak. But there was another reason the discovery of Smith's DNA mattered. It gave investigators something that every cold case detective needs: a point of focus. For years, the investigation had revolved around an unknown man, A biological profile existed, but a profile without an identity is difficult to investigate in the ordinary sense. There is no address to search, no employment history to examine, no relatives to interview, no known movements to reconstruct. The moment the profile was associated with a name, the investigation changed. Quentin Maurice Smith was no longer simply a possible genetic match. He became the center of a homicide investigation that reached back to 1991. And that meant investigators could begin asking questions that had been impossible before. Where had Smith been in Gary? Who had he known? What brought him into the area? Had anyone seen him with Curry? Had he ever explained where he was on November 26, 1991? Were there people from that period who could place him near the victim? The questions were simple. The answers were not. 31 years can bury an enormous amount of information. A person can change jobs, move to another state, build relationships, serve prison time, enter parole supervision, and continue living while an old case remains unresolved. Smith's later criminal history became significant because it ultimately placed his DNA within the law enforcement system. According to investigators, that reference profile provided the comparison necessary to connect him with the previously unidentified male DNA recovered from Curry's homicide scene. It was an unexpected bridge between two separate chapters of his life. One chapter began in 1991. The other existed decades later. And DNA connected them. But investigators still had to establish the circumstances surrounding that connection. This is where cold case investigations become less dramatic than the headlines suggest. There is no single moment when every mystery disappears. Instead, investigators work through evidence piece by piece. They compare laboratory findings with old reports. They revisit statements. They examine photographs. They search for records. They identify people who might still remember the victim. They determine which details can be corroborated and which cannot. And they separate what is known from what is merely suspected. That distinction is critical, because in a homicide investigation, assumptions can become dangerous. The DNA may point toward a person, but the evidence must still demonstrate what happened. That was particularly important in Curry's case because so much time had passed. The public could see the dramatic headline, "DNA solves 31-year-old murder." But investigators had to think differently. A cold case is not solved by a headline. It is solved by evidence that can withstand scrutiny. And so the investigation continued. The original crime scene became relevant again. Blood evidence was reconsidered. The unidentified male profile was no longer anonymous. The old reports gained new significance. And the investigators began assembling a new narrative from the remains of the old one. At the center of everything was John Thomas Curry, 35 years old, dead inside his apartment, stabbed multiple times. His death had produced a homicide investigation that failed to identify a suspect for 3 decades. There is something particularly unsettling about the passage of time in cases like this. A murder does not become less violent because it becomes old. The victim does not become less dead. The pain of the family does not automatically expire. Only the investigation becomes older. That is why cold case detectives often speak about giving victims another chance to be heard. Curry could not speak, but the evidence could. And now the evidence was pointing toward a man. The question became whether that man could be connected not merely to the apartment, but to the violence that occurred there. That required investigators to understand the physical evidence. The blood was especially important. Blood can tell investigators many things, depending on its location and condition. It can identify a person. It can establish that an injury occurred. It can sometimes help reconstruct movement. But blood alone does not narrate an entire crime. It must be interpreted alongside everything else. That is why the investigators returned to the original evidence. A stain in isolation can be ambiguous. A stain considered alongside photographs, reports, other biological samples, and witness information can become part of a much larger picture. The old case file, therefore, became a kind of archaeological site. Nothing could be casually discarded. Every report represented a decision made by investigators in 1991. Every sample represented something collected from the scene. Every statement represented someone's memory of events. The renewed investigation had to respect all of it. And while investigators worked, the case moved toward the legal system. On June 17, 2022, Smith was formally charged with murder in Lake County. 4 days later, authorities arrested him in Milwaukee. The geographical distance was striking. Curry's death had occurred in Gary. The suspect was found in Wisconsin. The investigation had crossed state boundaries, but the evidence had carried the case even farther. It had crossed decades. The arrest brought the case into the public eye again. But the legal process also imposed a discipline that the public rarely sees. Everything had to be proven. Every piece of evidence had to be authenticated. Every conclusion had to be supported. And every allegation had to remain an allegation until established in court. That is why the story should not be reduced to the simple phrase, DNA solved the murder. The DNA reopened the path. The investigators had to walk it. And the prosecutors had to prove where it led. For the people who had followed Curry's case for decades, the development must have felt almost surreal. For years, there had been nothing. Then suddenly there was a name, a charge, an arrest, a future possibility of courtroom proceedings. But the past remained. November 26, 1991. The apartment. The blood. The victim. The unknown man. Those facts had not changed. Only the understanding of them had. That is a strange power of forensic science. It can turn the same evidence into a different story. A blood sample can sit for years without producing an identity. Then a database expands. A reference profile becomes available. A laboratory performs a comparison. And suddenly, an anonymous trace becomes associated with a living person. The evidence did not become smarter. The world became better at listening to it. For Curry's case, that difference was enormous. But investigators still face the question of motive. The public naturally wants a reason. Why would anyone kill John Curry? What could have happened inside that apartment? What argument could have escalated into violence? Was the attack personal? Was it opportunistic? Was it connected to money? Was it connected to another dispute? Or was there some relationship between Curry and Smith that had never been understood? Without a publicly established motive, the murder retains an unsettling emptiness. There is a victim. There is an alleged offender. There is forensic evidence. But the emotional explanation remains incomplete. And sometimes motive is never fully understood. People can commit violence for reasons that seem irrational to everyone else. Investigators can establish what happened without ever discovering every thought inside the mind of the person accused. That is another reason homicide investigations are so difficult. Facts can be measured. Motives must often be reconstructed. The passage of time makes that reconstruction harder. The people who knew the victim in 1991 may remember his personality, but not every detail of his final days. The people who knew Smith may remember him differently. And the two worlds may never fully intersect. Still, the investigators continued, because every new fact could close another gap. The DNA answered one question. The remaining evidence had to answer the rest. What was the sequence of events? Where did the confrontation begin? How did Curry's blood and the unknown male's blood become part of the same crime scene? What happened immediately afterward? And why did the investigation fail to identify the man for 31 years? These questions were no longer theoretical. There was now a person to investigate. That alone changed the case forever. The investigators could examine Smith's known history. They could compare his DNA. They could look for connections. They could search for corroborating evidence. They could revisit witnesses. They could ask questions that had never been asked because there had never been a suspect to ask them about. That is the moment when a cold case begins to breathe again. Not because the past has changed, but because investigators finally have a way to interrogate it. For John Thomas Curry's family, the renewed investigation meant something even more fundamental. His death was being examined again. His name was being spoken again. The case was no longer a forgotten number in an archive. It had returned to the public record. 31 years after the killing, someone was finally being held responsible enough to face a murder accusation. But responsibility would ultimately have to be determined through the legal process. Until then, the evidence remained the story. The blood. The DNA. The old reports. The new analysis. The charge. The arrest. Each piece connected to the next. And yet the central image remained unchanged. A 35-year-old man. A quiet apartment. A violent death. A mystery that refused to disappear. For decades, the unanswered question had been who. Now investigators had a name. The next question was whether they could prove what that name meant. And that question was far more difficult. Because after 31 years, the past had finally opened the door. What investigators found on the other side would determine whether John Thomas Curry's family would finally receive something that had been missing since 1991. Not merely a suspect. Not merely an arrest. But the truth. The word truth can sound simple. In a homicide investigation, it rarely is. For John Thomas Curry's case, investigators had reached a point that detectives in 1991 could only have imagined. A biological profile that had remained unidentified for decades had been associated with a real person. But now came the difficult work of determining exactly what that connection meant. The evidence had survived. The question was whether the evidence could tell the whole story. By 2021, forensic technology had become dramatically more sophisticated than it had been when Curry was killed. Investigators could revisit old biological evidence with tools that simply did not exist in the same form when the original crime scene was processed. That meant the evidence collected in 1991 could acquire new meaning without anyone altering the underlying history. The blood had been there all along. The DNA had been there all along. Only the ability to interpret it had changed. That is what makes the timeline of Curry's case so remarkable. 1991. A homicide. An unidentified male. Then decades of silence. 2021. Modern DNA analysis. A database comparison. A name. 2022. A murder charge. An arrest. 3 decades had passed between the crime and the moment investigators could place a suspect at the center of the investigation. But the clock had not stopped. It had simply been running in the background. While the case remained cold, Smith continued to live his life. Curry's family continued theirs. The investigators who originally handled the case eventually moved on. And the evidence remained stored. That contrast is one of the most haunting features of cold cases. People move forward. Evidence waits. The biological material does not know that the investigators have reached a dead end. It does not know that a family has stopped expecting phone calls. It does not know that newspapers have stopped publishing the victim's name. It simply remains. Then, decades later, science asks the evidence another question. And sometimes the answer changes everything. For Curry's investigation, that answer led to Quentin Maurice Smith. But there was still a significant gap between identifying a possible offender and establishing what happened during the homicide. That gap had to be filled with evidence. Investigators had to examine the circumstances surrounding the DNA. They had to consider the original crime scene. They had to look again at the blood evidence. They had to determine whether the biological evidence was consistent with the prosecution's theory of the case. And they had to search for corroboration. A strong homicide case is rarely built from a single fact. It is built from convergence. One fact supports another. One piece of evidence confirms another. One witness statement fits the physical evidence. One laboratory result strengthens the timeline. Eventually, separate pieces begin pointing in the same direction. That was the challenge facing investigators in Curry's case. The DNA provided the first major direction. The rest of the investigation had to determine where that direction led. The original crime scene was crucial. Investigators had documented blood evidence from multiple locations. The existence of several samples associated with an unidentified male suggested that the unknown person had left biological material behind. That fact became far more important once the profile was connected to Smith. But investigators still had to consider context. DNA can establish identity. It cannot automatically establish intent. It cannot automatically establish the exact moment the material was deposited. It cannot automatically establish what happened before or after. Those questions require additional evidence. That is why the case could not end with the laboratory. The laboratory gave investigators a name. The investigation had to provide the narrative. And that narrative began with Curry. Who was he? What was happening in his life? Who knew him? Who had access to his apartment? Who had reason to visit? Who had reason to hurt him? These questions are not simply background. They can determine whether a forensic connection makes sense. If investigators can establish a relationship between a victim and a suspect, the DNA evidence gains context. If witnesses can place the suspect near the victim, the timeline becomes stronger. If physical evidence supports the same sequence, the case becomes more cohesive. But if major contradictions emerge, investigators must confront them. That is why the renewed investigation required patience. The arrest had generated headlines. The laboratory result had generated excitement. But detectives still had to do the slow work. Interview. Compare. Verify. Document. Reconstruct. Repeat. Cold cases often depend on that patience. The dramatic moment may be the arrest. The real investigation happens afterward. And the same evidence that created the breakthrough must survive every question that follows. For Curry's family, that process could feel agonizingly familiar. They had already waited 31 years. Now there was finally movement. But movement is not the same thing as resolution. A murder charge is not a conviction. An arrest is not a verdict. A DNA match is not a complete narrative. The legal system has to determine what the evidence proves. That distinction is particularly important when discussing the case publicly. The facts established by investigators must be separated from allegations. The victim's death is a fact. The recovery of biological evidence is a fact. The identification of a DNA profile is a fact. The 2022 murder charge is a fact. But the ultimate responsibility of the accused must be determined through due process. That is the line between documentary storytelling and speculation. And it is also the line that investigators must follow. The case had already survived 3 decades. Now it had to survive scrutiny. The public often imagines that the discovery of DNA creates an immediate ending. But the reality is almost the opposite. DNA can create a beginning. Once a person is identified, investigators can finally ask questions they could not ask before. They can investigate relationships. They can reconstruct movements. They can seek corroborating witnesses. They can examine records. They can determine whether the suspect's history intersects with the victim's life. And they can revisit evidence that previously had no obvious meaning. That is the real power of a cold case DNA breakthrough. It changes the investigation from searching for anyone to testing a specific theory. For Curry's case, the theory now centered on Smith. And that meant the investigators could finally begin to examine the years surrounding the murder through a new lens. Where was Smith in 1991? What was he doing? Who knew him? Where did he live? How could he have come into contact with Curry? Was there a known connection between them? Were there witnesses who could confirm that connection? The answers to those questions would determine how much weight the DNA evidence could ultimately carry. But some mysteries are difficult to reconstruct even with a suspect. Motive can remain elusive. People do not always leave written explanations for violence. Arguments disappear. Relationships change. Friends forget. And when decades pass, the emotional context of an event can become almost impossible to recover. That may be one of the darkest aspects of Curry's case. The physical evidence survived. The human context may not have. The blood could still be tested. The memories could not. And that imbalance gave the case its strange character. Science could recover something the human mind had lost. A genetic identity. A connection. A name. But science could not automatically recover the final conversation between two men inside an apartment in 1991. Only witnesses, records, or the people involved could potentially provide that. And after 31 years, those sources could be incomplete. Still, the investigation moved forward. Smith was arrested in Milwaukee. He was awaiting extradition to Indiana. The case that began on Carolina Street had now traveled across state lines. But geographically, it had traveled much farther. It had crossed 3 decades of American history, 3 decades of technological change, 3 decades of forensic development, 3 decades in which the same evidence sat quietly while investigators waited for a breakthrough. And now the breakthrough had arrived. The most remarkable part was not that technology had discovered new blood. It had not. The evidence was old. What was new was the ability to identify the person associated with it. That single distinction changed everything. For the first time, the unidentified male had a name. And once a suspect has a name, the case can become a story again. Not a forgotten story. Not an archive story. A living investigation. But the deeper investigators went, the more they were forced to confront the original mystery. The DNA could tell them that Smith's profile was associated with biological evidence from the crime scene. The charge could tell them prosecutors believed there was sufficient basis to accuse him of murder. The arrest could tell them the case had reached a new stage. But none of those facts alone could answer the question that haunted Curry's family. What happened during those final minutes? Somewhere inside the apartment, the lives of 2 men intersected. One survived long enough to leave the scene. The other did not. One carried the future with him. The other became a memory. For 31 years, investigators had no way to connect those 2 stories. Now they had a thread. A biological thread. A thread that began with blood and ended with a name. But a thread is not the whole story. It has to be followed. It has to be tested. It has to be connected to everything else. And that is where the investigation stood after the arrest. The mystery had not disappeared. It had changed. For decades, the mystery was the identity of the unknown man. Now the mystery was the meaning of the evidence. And perhaps that is the most difficult stage of any cold case. Finding a suspect can feel like the ending. It is not. It is the moment when every unanswered question becomes more urgent. Because once there is a name, there must be an explanation. Why was he there? What happened? And why did John Thomas Curry never walk away from that apartment? Those questions had waited for 31 years. Now, finally, investigators had someone to ask them about. And the evidence was waiting to see whether the answers would match what it had been saying all along. The investigation had reached the point where every unanswered question seemed to lead back to the same place. The apartment. The blood. And the night John Thomas Curry died. For decades, those three elements had remained separated by uncertainty. Investigators knew the location. They knew the victim. They knew a violent crime had occurred. They had preserved biological evidence. What they did not have was the identity of the unknown male. Now they did. Quentin Maurice Smith had become the person investigators needed to examine. But the past does not surrender its secrets simply because a suspect has been identified. There was still the question of movement. If Smith was responsible, how did he arrive at the apartment? How did he leave? What happened between those moments? Was Curry expecting someone? Did the encounter begin peacefully? Did an argument suddenly become violent? Or had the confrontation already begun before the two men entered the apartment? The public record surrounding the case does not answer every one of those questions. That absence is important. A documentary can describe what investigators established without inventing what they did not. And sometimes what is unknown is more powerful than anything that can be stated with certainty. Because the murder happened in 1991. The evidence is real. The DNA connection is real. The charge is real. The arrest is real. But the complete sequence of events remains something investigators and prosecutors must establish through evidence. That is where the distinction between a cold case investigation and a finished criminal case becomes crucial. A cold case asks, can we find the person? A prosecution asks, can we prove what that person did? Those are two different questions. For 31 years, investigators could not answer the first. By 2022, they had made enormous progress. Now the second question became the challenge. The DNA evidence was central, but it existed within a larger crime scene. 8 samples had been associated with an unidentified male. That number mattered because investigators were not dealing with a single isolated biological trace. They were examining multiple pieces of evidence from the same homicide scene. Once a profile was connected to Smith, those samples acquired new significance. They were no longer anonymous. They could be considered alongside the rest of the evidence. And that is how forensic investigations grow. A single clue becomes a connection. The connection becomes a theory. The theory is tested against everything else. If it survives, investigators move forward. If it fails, they return to the beginning. The Curry investigation had spent 3 decades without a clear identity. Now investigators had the opportunity to test a specific theory. That alone represented an enormous change. But time remained the enemy. The original investigators had worked under the conditions of 1991. Modern detectives were working with the remnants of that investigation. Some evidence could be retested. Some records could be reviewed. Some people could be interviewed again. But not everything could be recovered. Memory is not evidence storage. A human mind does not preserve every conversation with perfect accuracy for 31 years. People remember impressions. They forget dates. They combine events. They lose names. And sometimes memories change without the person realizing it. That is why physical evidence is so valuable. It does not wake up one morning and decide that the past happened differently. A properly preserved sample remains what it was. That was the silent strength of the evidence in Curry's case. The blood had no memory. It had no motive. It had no opinion. It simply existed. And decades later, it produced information. The laboratory gave investigators the genetic profile. Cody's provided the comparison. The investigation produced the suspect. The legal process produced the charge. The arrest brought the case into a new era. But the family still had the same question. What happened to John? For relatives of homicide victims, legal language can feel painfully incomplete. Suspect. Defendant. Charge. Evidence. Investigation. Those words describe a case. They do not describe the person who was lost. John Curry was not a case file when he was alive. He was a person with ordinary routines and relationships. Then one day, his name became attached to a homicide investigation. That transformation happens in seconds. A person becomes a victim. A home becomes a crime scene. A family becomes a victim's family. And the search for answers begins. Sometimes that search lasts days. Sometimes months. Sometimes years. For Curry's family, it lasted decades. 31 years is long enough for an entire generation to grow up without knowing the answer to a question that should have been settled quickly. Who killed him? The DNA breakthrough did not erase that time. But it changed the future. For the first time, investigators could place a name inside the investigation. And that name created a new possibility. Accountability. Not certainty. Not yet. Accountability through the legal process. That distinction mattered because Smith was charged, not convicted. The accusation had to be tested. The evidence had to be presented. And the defense had the right to challenge it. That is the nature of the justice system. Even in a case that has waited 31 years. Even when investigators believe they have finally found the person responsible. The burden remains. The evidence must speak for itself. And that brings the story back to the DNA. DNA evidence can be extraordinarily powerful. But it is never simply a magic answer. Investigators must establish how the sample was collected, how it was stored, how it was analyzed, how the profile was generated, how the comparison was made, and how the result fits the circumstances of the crime. Every step matters. Every link in the chain matters, especially when decades have passed. The defense can challenge the laboratory work. It can question the chain of custody. It can question the circumstances surrounding the DNA. It can challenge the prosecution's interpretation. That is why a forensic breakthrough is only the beginning of the legal process. For the investigators, however, the breakthrough had already accomplished something enormous. It had revived a case that might otherwise have remained unresolved indefinitely. The case had a direction. The investigation had momentum. The victim's name was back in the news. And the public learned that the evidence from 1991 had never truly stopped speaking. It had simply been waiting for someone to understand it. There is something almost haunting about that idea. Imagine the apartment after the crime. Police arrive. Photographs are taken. Evidence is collected. Blood samples are packaged. Reports are written. Then the scene is eventually released. The world moves on. But inside an evidence facility, those samples remain. Year after year. Decade after decade. 1992. 1993. 1994. 1995. 1996. 1997. 1998. The case grows older. The evidence does not necessarily become irrelevant. Then 2021 arrives. A laboratory looks again. The old sample is tested. A profile appears. The profile enters a database. A match emerges. Suddenly, 30 years collapse into a single investigative lead. That is what makes cold case DNA work so extraordinary. The breakthrough is separated from the crime by time. But the evidence connects them instantly. For Curry's case, that connection reached from Indiana to Wisconsin. It crossed from 1991 to 2022. And it transformed an unknown man into a named defendant. Still, the question of motive remained. And motive is often the most difficult piece of a homicide investigation. Even if investigators can reconstruct the physical sequence, they may never fully understand why the violence occurred. Maybe the motive was personal. Maybe it was financial. Maybe it was connected to a dispute. Maybe the confrontation was sudden. Maybe the reason disappeared with the people involved. The public naturally wants a simple explanation. But real homicide cases are rarely simple. Human relationships are complicated. Violence can emerge from circumstances that are impossible to understand from outside. That is why investigators must separate facts from assumptions. What they know, what they believe, what they can prove, and what remains unknown. In Curry's case, the known facts were already enough to produce a major breakthrough. But the unknowns remained. And those unknowns were concentrated around the final hours of John's life. The apartment, the confrontation, the blood, the departure, the discovery. Everything depended on what happened in that narrow window of time. A few minutes can change an entire life. For John Curry, those minutes became permanent. For his family, they became 31 years of questions. For investigators, they became the center of a cold case file. And for the man accused of killing him, they became the basis of a murder prosecution. That is the point where the story becomes more than a forensic mystery. It becomes a question of justice. Can evidence from 1991 establish what happened? Can modern science reconstruct an old crime? Can a family finally receive an explanation? And can a legal system hold someone accountable after more than 3 decades? Those questions were no longer theoretical. They were suddenly active. The arrest had changed the case. The DNA had changed the investigation. But John Curry's final story still had to be reconstructed. And somewhere within the evidence preserved from that apartment was the answer. Not an answer invented by hindsight. Not a story created to fill empty spaces. An answer supported by facts. That was the only answer that mattered. Because 31 years after John Thomas Curry's death, investigators had finally found the person whose biological evidence was allegedly left behind. Now they had to determine what the evidence truly meant. The clock had been running since November 26, 1991. For decades, no one could stop it. Now investigators were going backward, minute by minute, evidence by evidence, question by question, until eventually the silence would have nowhere left to hide.